Welcome to Boring Roman History for Sleep, a quiet space to unwind with slow, gentle stories from the ancient world. Tonight, we follow the path of a boy from the Roman countryside who leaves behind a simple life in the fields to begin his journey as a legionary. Before we begin, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always nice to know we're drifting into history together. The sun had just begun to rise over the fields outside a small Roman village, its golden light spreading slowly across the low hills and waking the countryside with warmth. Dew clung to the tall grasses, and a quiet mist hovered near the edge of the forest, where wild olive trees cast long, thin shadows across the land. A young boy, no older than 16, stood near a low stone wall that bordered his family's farm. He wore a simple tunic, rough woven and stained from work, and his sandals were still damp from the morning's walk through the fields. A satchel hung from his shoulder, light and loosely packed. His hands were calloused from labour, his face tanned by years beneath the sun, but his eyes were fixed toward the distant road. It was quiet. Behind him, the low sounds of the farm stirred. Chickens scratching near the coop, the soft bleat of a goat, the creak of a wooden cart being pulled from the shed. His father would be gathering tools, preparing for another day in the barley fields. His mother might already be kneading dough by the hearth, and yet this morning was different. This morning, he wouldn't be working the land. He would be leaving it. Far off in the distance, just past the last bend in the road, a Roman recruiting post had been set up near a crossroads. For weeks now, he'd heard whispers about it in the village. Legion officials had come through, offering coin, clothing, and the promise of a future. The pay was steady, the meals guaranteed. For many boys from farms like his, it was the only way to see the world beyond their fields. He adjusted the strap of his satchel and took a long, quiet breath. The air smelled of cut grass and old stone. A breeze carried the scent of bread baking on a nearby hearth. He memorized it, held it close. Then, without a word, he stepped past the wall. His journey had begun. The dirt path stretched out before him, winding gently between low hills and dry fields dotted with fig trees and tall, whispering grass. It was a road the boy had walked many times before, but never with such purpose. Each step felt different now, not just the distance from home increasing behind him, but the quiet certainty that something in him was shifting too. He walked at an easy pace, the weight of the satchel familiar against his hip, his wooden staff tapping softly at the ground with every other step. The morning sun rose higher, warming the back of his neck and glinting off the dew still clinging to tall stalks of grain. A few bees buzzed lazily from wildflowers blooming in the ditches. Birds circled overhead in the wide blue sky, their cries soft and distant. To his right, olive groves lined the hills, their twisted trunks casting long, finger-like shadows across the slope. The smell of dust and herbs, thyme, rosemary, crushed leaves, filled the air. The sounds of the countryside followed him quietly. A dog barking from a far-off villa, a wheel turning somewhere on a cart, the creak of leather straps as oxen pulled a plough. He passed an old shepherd resting beneath a cypress tree, his flock grazing nearby. The man raised a hand in silent greeting, and the boy nodded respectfully as he walked past. There were no words exchanged, only that shared look, the recognition between one life staying behind and another moving forward. The road became rockier as he neared the first outpost. Dust kicked up beneath his sandals, clinging to the hem of his tunic. He paused now and then to sip water from a leather skin, its contents warm but soothing. With no rush ahead of him and no responsibilities trailing behind, he allowed himself to stop whenever the breeze carried a coolness or a view opened wide enough to deserve admiration. At one such bend, the land dipped into a small valley. A stream curved along the bottom, sparkling in the sun. He crouched at its edge, scooping water into his hands, letting it run over his palms and drip from his fingers. It tasted clean, cold. He sat there for a moment, letting the shade of a nearby tree offer him a pocket of relief from the sun. For just a minute, he listened. Not to voices, but to wind in the reeds, the splash of a fish beneath the surface, the creak of the branches above. By midday, the road levelled out again, and he saw signs of other travellers, footprints in the dirt, wagon ruts, a few scattered pebbles that had clearly been kicked from a cartwheel's path. Then, just beyond the next hill, the top of a red banner appeared, fluttering gently in the wind. He quickened his pace. The Roman recruitment post was not grand, just a stone platform built alongside a crossroads, with a pair of wooden pavilions and a standard bearing the eagle of the legion. A few soldiers in uniform lounged beneath the shade of a canvas awning. Their armour gleamed dully in the sun, and their voices carried the relaxed tone of men unhurried by duty. One of them, older, with a thick beard and a centurion's crimson crest on his helmet, looked up as the boy approached. He didn't speak at first. He just watched the boy walk, measuring his steps, noting the way he carried himself. When the boy stopped at the edge of the platform, he stood tall. He didn't puff his chest or force his chin high. He simply looked the man in the eye and gave a slight nod. "Name?" the centurion asked, his voice quiet but firm. The boy answered clearly, adding his father's name, his village, and his age. The centurion studied him for a moment longer, then stepped aside and pointed toward a bench beneath the pavilion. "Wait there," he said. "You're not the first farm boy today." The boy obeyed, sitting in the cool shadow of the canopy, his heart steady. Around him, other recruits waited as well, some quiet, some murmuring, some fidgeting. He didn't speak. He watched the dust blow across the stones. He listened to the creak of leather, the hum of flies, the shifting of sandals against the ground. His journey had brought him here, but it was only just beginning. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the paved courtyard beside the recruitment station. A warm breeze stirred the fabric of the red banners flanking the pavilion, their embroidered eagles catching golden light as they moved. The boy sat patiently on the bench, his satchel at his feet, the weight of the day settling gently on his shoulders. He was neither nervous nor eager, just present, listening, watching. Around him, the sounds of the outpost carried in soft layers. A clerk scratched records into wax tablets behind a small table. A mule brayed lazily near a water trough. Somewhere nearby, a smith tapped gently at a piece of iron, the rhythmic pings echoing off the low stone walls. The scent of baked earth, leather, and the faintest trace of olive oil lingered in the air. The centurion who had spoken to him earlier returned, his stride calm but purposeful. He carried a wooden rod, short, smooth, and unadorned. Not a weapon, but a marker of command. He stopped before the boy and motioned with his chin. "Come." The boy stood, brushing the dust from his tunic and following the centurion towards the main platform. Another soldier, older and broader in frame, waited near a set of measuring poles. He didn't speak, just gestured for the boy to stand tall, back straight, heels against the stone. The examination was quiet, efficient, height, posture, teeth, hands. The man grunted faintly with approval as he lifted the boy's arm and pressed a thumb against the shoulder joint, then the chest, the jaw. All the while, the centurion stood just behind, making notes on a narrow wax tablet held in his palm. "Strong enough," the examiner muttered. "No limp, no cloud in the eyes." The centurion looked to the boy again, his expression unreadable. "Ever held a blade?" "Yes," the boy replied simply. "To fight or to harvest? To clear thorns, to drive pigs." A faint smile tugged at the edge of the centurion's mouth. "It's a start." He motioned for the boy to follow again, this time leading him toward a small shrine set into the corner of the platform. It was modest, just a raised stone with small bronze statues of Mars, Jupiter, and Roma. A tiny flame danced atop an iron bowl, casting flickers of light onto the curved metal figures. The centurion took a short scroll from a box and unrolled it. He held it loosely in one hand, then looked to the boy. "This part is simple. Speak clearly." The boy nodded. The centurion read slowly. "You swear by the gods of Rome, by your family, and by your own life, to serve in the legions with loyalty and discipline, to obey your commanders, to protect the empire, to never desert, to never betray." The boy repeated the words, not with ceremony but with calm. The flame fluttered once, as if acknowledging the oath. When the last word had been spoken, the centurion rolled the scroll again and tapped the edge of the stone with 2 fingers. He turned, handed the boy a small token, a wooden tablet with his name and cohort scratched into the surface, and nodded. "You're in. Welcome to the Legion." The boy held the token in his hand and looked at it. The wood was warm from the centurion's grip. The letters were shallow but clear. It felt heavier than it looked. "Report at sunrise," the centurion said. "You'll be issued gear then. Sleep comes early in uniform." The boy gave a small bow of his head and stepped away. He didn't feel different. Not yet. His hands were the same. His breath steady. The road home still lay behind him, but he no longer stood upon it. As he returned to the shaded bench, he tucked the wooden token into his satchel and sat down, eyes following a line of ants crossing the paving stones at his feet. He was no longer a farm boy. He was a legionary in waiting. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving behind only a faint orange band clinging to the edge of the hills. The sky above had turned a deep shade of blue, scattered with stars just beginning to show. In the distance, olive trees stood in quiet silhouette, and the low sounds of evening life, crickets, nightbirds, the occasional creak of timber, rose gently around the small outpost. The boy sat near a modest fire pit, one of several set up for new recruits who had arrived that day. There were 6 of them in total, 2 from hill villages, 1 from a port town, and the rest, like him, from farms. They sat in a rough circle, not tightly drawn, but close enough to share the warmth of the flames. Most of them said little. There were no formal introductions, no stories of past glories, just quiet nods, the exchange of names, and shared sips of water from past skins. He hadn't realized how tired he was until he sat still. The walk, the heat, the tension of being examined and sworn in, it all had crept up on him slowly. Now, the muscles in his legs felt heavy, his eyelids a little slower to lift. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and watched the flames move through the dry wood. The fire cracked softly, casting a warm, golden glow on the dust-covered faces of the young men around him. One of them, taller, with a crooked nose and a few days' head start in stubble, pulled out a cloth bundle and unwrapped a bit of goat cheese and barley bread. He broke it into pieces and passed them around without a word. The boy took his share, nodded in thanks, and ate slowly. The bread was dry, the cheese sharp. But after a day like this, it tasted like something more. A few spoke eventually, quiet stories about home, about brothers and sisters, about animals or weather or rivers they used to fish. One boy described the way the sea sounded at night near his home, how the waves hit the breakwall with slow, deliberate force. Another spoke about snow in the mountains, how it would cover the roofs and muffle the sounds of carts on the road. The boy didn't speak much. He listened. He liked the way their voices blended with the night, low, careful, never rising above the fire. They were strangers, but not unfamiliar. They all shared something now, even if they didn't have words for it yet. Not far from the circle, a senior soldier walked past, checking that the recruits were settled in for the night. He gave a brief glance but didn't stop. His presence was enough to remind them that this was no longer home. There would be no late hours, no stories until dawn. Discipline had begun, even if it hadn't been spoken yet. As the fire faded to red embers, the boy stood and gathered his cloak. The makeshift sleeping area, just a flat patch of ground beside a low wall, wasn't much, but it was dry and shielded from the wind. He laid out his rolled-up satchel as a pillow and pulled the cloak over himself. He lay on his back, eyes open, watching the stars blink slowly into full brightness overhead. Somewhere, beyond the outpost, wolves might be calling in the distance. But here, near the camp, there was only the sound of steady breathing and the rustle of cloaks shifting in sleep. He didn't know what the morning would bring, what gear he'd be handed, what orders he'd be given, what training would feel like. But he wasn't afraid. Not exactly, just aware. He stared at the stars for a while, following the same ones he'd seen from his family's field. They hadn't changed, only he had. The morning horn sounded before the sky had begun to lighten, a deep, clear note that rose over the outpost with certainty, as if it belonged to the very stones beneath their feet. The boy stirred beneath his cloak, his body stiff from sleeping on packed earth, but not unready. Around him, the other new recruits shifted as well, pulling themselves upright, rubbing the sleep from their eyes, some groaning softly as they sat up. The air was cool and damp, the kind that clings to grass and skin alike. A low mist hung in the distance, blurring the line where hills met sky. In the quiet that followed the horn, the boy stood and stretched his arms, cloak slipping from his shoulders. The ground beneath him was cold through the soles of his sandals, but there was no time to linger. A soldier barked an order from near the pavilion, short, direct. "Form up!" Without needing to be told twice, the boy fell into line with the others. They were led to a wide open space near the edge of the outpost, where 2 tables had been set up beneath a long canopy. Behind them stood 3 men, 1 officer, 2 quartermasters, and a pile of gear stacked with almost casual precision. Tunics, belts, cloaks, shields, and to the side a row of gladian helmets, their metal catching the first hints of dawn. The officer, tall and lean with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel, stepped forward. "You're not farmers anymore," he said plainly. "You're recruits of Rome, and Rome dresses its soldiers like soldiers. 1 set of gear. Take care of it, and it'll take care of you." He nodded to the quartermasters, who began calling names. One by one, the boys stepped forward, handed their issued gear with little ceremony. A brown tunic, sleeveless and rough-spun. a thick leather belt with a bronze buckle, too large and meant to be cut down to fit. A cloak dyed a faded red, woolen and scratchy. A pair of caligae, Roman military sandals, their soles embedded with iron hobnails that clinked softly when dropped onto the table. When the boy's name was called, he stepped forward, hands steady. He accepted each item as it was passed to him. The weight of the belt, the stiffness of the cloak, the way the sandals seemed impossibly wide at first glance. The last item was a folded tabula, a thin wooden board with his cohort and unit scratched in black ink. He tucked it into his satchel without looking at it. "You'll be shown how to wear it all. Don't try to look smart," the quartermaster muttered. "Just try to look like you belong." The boy stepped back, arms full of gear. Around him, the others examined their own pieces. Some tried on their sandals. Others held up the cloaks and frowned at their length. But there was no laughter, no complaints, just quiet adjustment. A few nodded to one another in passing. Small gestures of shared experience. Under the direction of an older soldier, they moved to a shaded alcove where they were shown how to dress, how to bind the sandals correctly, how to fasten the belt so that it sat low across the hips, not high on the waist. The tunic was knotted at the shoulder with a leather cord, and the cloak slung over the left side, ready to be wrapped or removed depending on the weather. Once dressed, the boy looked down at himself. The tunic hung awkwardly at first, and the sandals pinched in places, but it was already beginning to feel right. Not because it fit, because it meant something. He stood among the others, all now dressed in the same uniform, no longer sons of shepherds or vineyard workers. They had no rank, no fame, not yet, but they looked the part, and sometimes that was the first step. From a distance, the centurion watched them with crossed arms and an unreadable face. "They look like boys playing dress-up," he murmured to the officer beside him. The officer shrugged. "For now. By winter they'll be soldiers." The boy didn't hear him. He was busy adjusting the buckle on his belt, eyes narrowed, fingers working with quiet focus. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't dreaming. He was becoming. The sun had climbed only halfway up the sky, but the heat was already building across the open yard where the new recruit stood. A soft haze shimmered above the earth, and dust clung to the air, stirred by boots and movement. The boy, now dressed in his new uniform, stood in a long, uneven line of fellow recruits, each of them squinting into the sunlight, their shoulders drawn back with effort and uncertainty. Their instructor paced before them, a man named Gaius with a shaved head, a thick leather strap looped over one shoulder, and a voice that needed no echo to carry. He didn't shout to intimidate, he simply didn't have to. His tone was even, clipped, and absolute. Every word landed like a pebble dropped into still water. And every time he turned his gaze on a recruit, that man straightened his spine just a little more. "Your mouth," Gaius said calmly as he passed the line, "is not part of your training." He stopped abruptly in front of a lanky boy who had dared to whisper. The recruit froze, wide-eyed. Gaius looked him up and down, then turned and continued walking. "Your legs will learn to march. Your hands will learn to grip. But your mind must learn to be still. That's harder." The boy, standing near the end of the line, said nothing. He kept his chin forward, his shoulders even. The tunic stuck to his back where sweat was beginning to form. His sandals pressed hard against the ground, the hobnails biting gently into the dirt with every shift in weight. The first lesson was simple: standing, not walking, not fighting, just standing. Feet shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, shoulders down, chest lifted, arms relaxed, hands resting lightly at the sides or placed over the front of the belt, Not clenched, not fidgeting, just still. At first it seemed easy, but after 10 minutes beneath the sun, bodies began to sway. Ankles ached, shoulders tightened, sweat traced slow paths down backs and temples. And yet, Gaius said nothing. He only walked the line, silently watching, measuring. The boy kept his eyes forward, not fixed on anything, just gazing into the bright middle distance. A small bird flitted across the edge of the yard, landing on the top of a broken column. The breeze stirred his cloak, just enough to offer a little relief. He remembered his father once saying that you can't hold a plough straight if you're watching your feet. He thought of that now. The line was his field. His job was to stay in it. After what felt like an hour, Gaius finally spoke again. "Some of you will not last a week," he said simply. "But if you learn to stand, you will learn to march. If you learn to march, you will learn to fight. If you learn to fight, you may live long enough to do something besides die." No one laughed. No one shifted. Gaius nodded. "Break. Return in 30 minutes. Hydrate." The lines scattered slowly, each recruit stepping away in silence, rubbing shoulders or rotating sore ankles. The boy walked to the edge of the yard and crouched near a water jar, scooping cool water into his hands and splashing it over his face. It ran down his neck, cutting through the heat. He didn't speak to the others. Some exchanged glances. A few grumbled. But he stayed quiet, stretching his arms, watching the dust settle where their feet had stood. Standing had seemed like nothing. Now it meant everything. He knew tomorrow it would be worse. Longer drills, more heat, harsher correction. But for now, he had stood where he was told. He had not shifted. He had not been called out. It was a beginning. And beginnings, he was learning, were made of smaller things than he had imagined. The morning drills had passed like slow thunder, loud, heavy, and unavoidable. By the time the sun reached its peak, the recruits had already marched laps around the perimeter, practiced turning in formation, and had been corrected more times than they could count. But the hardest lesson came after the noon break, when Gaius returned with a quiet order and a stack of fresh gear. Today, they would learn to carry the scutum. The boy had seen them before, those tall, curved shields that seemed to cover a man from shoulder to shin. He'd admired them from afar, their bold red paint and central iron boss, polished bright. They looked strong, heroic, but he'd never felt their weight. Now, as the shield was placed in his arms, he understood. The scutum was made of layered wood, reinforced with rawhide and lined with metal edging. It curved inward, forming a shell around the bearer's torso. At rest, it stood nearly as tall as his chest. When he gripped the center handle and lifted it, the weight dragged instantly at his shoulder and forearm. It wasn't unbearable, but it was unforgiving. Gaius barked instructions. Left arm through the loop, center grip firm, rested at the edge of your foot. Now hold. The boy did as he was told. The shield was awkward at first. The curve pressed against his ribs. The iron boss pressed outward like a fist in front of him. He shifted slightly to find balance, and immediately Gaius was there. "Don't fidget," the instructor said, tapping the rim of the shield with his vine staff. "If you shift, your line breaks. If your line breaks, your brother dies." The boy swallowed, nodded once, and steadied his stance. They stood with the shields for 20 minutes. No marching, no formation, just learning to bear the weight. Around him, others shifted their feet, adjusted their grips, fought against the slow burn in their arms. Some whispered curses. One recruit let his shield fall with a loud thud and was made to run a lap in full gear as the others watched. The boy stayed quiet, focused. The shield pressed harder into his arm with each passing minute, but he didn't drop it. He stared ahead, his breath even. He imagined the wind rustling barley fields, his father's hand guiding his own as they walked the rows, the steady, planted feeling of knowing where to step. Then came the drills. "Form up," Gaius called. "Line of 4, lock shields, advance." They moved awkwardly at first. The boy took his position at the front, the edge of his scutum overlapping the one to his left. Their shields bumped, scraped, misaligned. Gaius walked the line, correcting, slapping his staff against wood. Too wide, too narrow, too slow. Again. They stepped forward in unison, shields locked, arms burning. The sound of their caligai thudding against the dirt formed a heavy rhythm. The boy's fingers ached from gripping the handle. His shoulder trembled slightly from the strain, but he held on. They practiced for nearly an hour. By the end, his tunic clung to his back with sweat. Dust lined the edges of his cloak. His arm felt like it had been hammered from iron and dragged across a forge. But he hadn't dropped the shield. As they broke formation and the shield was finally lowered, he felt a rush of quiet relief. His arm tingled. His hand ached. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else. Something like pride, but softer. A sense of having carried something real. He sat on a nearby rock, catching his breath. Another recruit slumped beside him, groaning. "Doesn't look so heroic now, does it?" the boy said quietly, with a faint smile. The other soldier chuckled. "I'd rather carry a sack of bricks." The boy didn't answer. He looked at the shield, now resting beside his leg. It was scratched, smudged, dusty, but it had stood in front of him, and he had stood behind it. And tomorrow, he would do it again. The next day began in silence, not the peaceful kind, but the quiet that comes before something difficult. The recruits rose with the sun, the sky still painted in soft strokes of grey and rose gold. Cloaks were pulled tightly over shoulders, sandals laced with care, waterskins filled. No one said much. The boy felt it too, that calm tension, like the moment before a rainstorm, when the wind pauses and the leaves hold their breath. Today was the first true march. They had practiced standing, forming ranks, turning on command. But today they would move as one, row by row, shield to shield, step after step. It was not about speed. It was about rhythm. The Roman legion did not run. It advanced. And the difference between the two could mean everything. Gaius stood waiting near the training yard, arms folded, expression unreadable. "You've learned to wear the tunic," he said, voice carrying without effort. "You've carried the shield. You've stood like statues. But statues don't conquer. Marching does. Form your line." The recruits fell into position, 4 across, 5 deep. The boy stood on the left edge of the second row, glancing briefly at the back of the man in front of him. They were all roughly the same height now, with helmets snug and gladii hanging stiffly from their belts. The air smelled of iron, sweat, and dust. Gaius raised his hand, palm flat. Then he brought it down. "Advance." The first row moved forward, then the second, then the third. The sound of sandals on packed earth filled the space between the buildings. Steady, rough, rhythmic. Hobnails struck the ground with a muted clatter, uniform and purposeful. At first, the boy tried to listen for his own feet, but the moment he did, he lost the beat. He stumbled slightly, catching himself. That was the first lesson. You don't listen to yourself. You listen to everyone. They rounded the outer edge of the training yard, shields resting on their backs, arms swinging just enough to maintain balance. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows behind them. Gaius barked instructions from the side. Closer. Hold the line. Watch the spacing. Each command was followed by adjustment, tiny shifts in gait, small corrections in posture. The boy focused not on the ground beneath him, but on the rhythm of movement. He aligned his pace with the man ahead. Match the breath of the one beside him. Let the sound of many feet become his guide. By the second circuit, the clumsiness began to melt away. Their lines straightened. The stomping grew less chaotic, more unified. A slow thunder, not random, but built from discipline. The boy no longer felt like he was walking alone. He was being carried by something larger, an invisible thread connecting each man to the next. When one adjusted, all did. When one leaned, the line leaned with him. They marched for over an hour, stopping only for brief corrections. Where they finally halted, dust clung to their calves, and their faces shone with sweat. Gaius walked down the line, eyes sharp. "You looked like villagers with swords this morning," he said. "Now, you almost look like soldiers." There were no cheers, no pats on the back, just the sound of heavy breathing and the quiet pride that settled into the corners of tired eyes. Later, the boy sat beneath the shade of a fig tree near the yard. His water skin was half empty, his tunic damp. But his chest felt steady, his feet sore but purposeful. One of the other recruits leaned back beside him, arms stretched out behind his head. "You hear that sound when we marched?" the recruit asked. The boy nodded. "Like a drum," he said. "Yeah," the other man replied. "Like we were all parts of one thing." The boy didn't respond, but he knew what the other meant. He had felt it too. It wasn't just marching. It was becoming Roman. It was the blisters he remembered most from that day. Not the ache in his back or the dull throb in his shoulders, but the sharp, pulsing sting at the base of each heel, where the leather of his caligae had rubbed against skin now raw and bright with irritation. The morning had begun like the one before it, with the same horn call, the same routines, folding of cloaks, splashing of water on the face, adjusting belt straps, and checking gear. But today was different. Today, they weren't training inside the post. They were marching out. Gaius had ordered the recruits to form up with full packs, not just shields and weapons, but their full marching burdens, blankets, rations, spare tunics, water skins, and entrenching tools all secured to wooden carrying poles. The sarcina, they called it, the soldier's burden. Carried over one shoulder, it shifted with every step and reminded them, with every bounce, that they now belonged to the legions. The line began moving shortly after dawn. They left through the east gate and followed a well-worn path into the countryside, a narrow strip of packed earth lined with cypress trees and scattered stones. At first, the boy admired the calm, the cool air, the soft crunch of boots on earth, the occasional chirp of birds overhead. But after an hour, the sun began to rise higher. The breeze faded. The packs grew heavier, and the blisters began to form. At first, it was just a warm spot, barely noticeable. But with every step, the rubbing worsened. His boots, though well laced, had never been worn over such distance, and now the leather betrayed him. Sweat added to the friction. The hobnails made every impact feel like a tiny hammer strike on the ball of his foot. He didn't complain. No one did. Even when a boy near the front stumbled and had to be helped to his feet, he said nothing. Gaius watched from the rear, sharp eyes scanning for weakness. He didn't speak. But the message was clear. The legions would not carry the weak. You either endured or you didn't. By midday, the line had grown quieter. Breaths were deeper, faces flushed. Even the sound of footsteps seemed more labored. They stopped briefly near a cluster of trees, where the shade gave them a moment's pause. The boy sank to the ground and unfastened one boot, peeling it back slowly. The blister was the size of a coin, pale at the edges, swollen at the center. He winced as he touched it. Next to him, another recruit, older, with a short beard and a scar along his jaw, leaned over and offered a strip of cloth. "Wrap it," he said simply. "Tight, not too tight. You'll walk on it either way." The boy nodded, grateful. He wrapped the foot as best he could, then pulled the boot back on. The pressure was immediate, but tolerable. He drank from his water skin, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked out across the road ahead. They still had miles to go. When the horn sounded again, the line reformed without a word. Shields were hoisted, packs adjusted, and the march resumed. Step by step, the pain in his feet returned, but so did something else, a sense of rhythm, of moving not alone, but as part of something greater. Every man was hurting. Every man walked anyway. By the time they returned to camp, the sun was beginning to set. The sky had turned a dusky orange, and the scent of smoke from cook fires drifted across the yard. The boy limped slightly as he made his way to the bench outside the tent, easing the pack from his shoulder with care. He peeled off his boots once more. The blisters had burst. The skin was red, raw, and angry. But they hadn't stopped him. He sat in silence, feet in the dirt, staring at the sky as it deepened into blue. The ache would fade. The pain would scab over. But the lesson would remain. The march wasn't about glory. It wasn't about strength. It was about finishing. The morning light crept gently over the training yard, casting long shadows between the rows of standing recruits. The dust from the previous day's march still lingered in the air, clinging to the hems of tunics and the soles of worn caligae. No one had slept well, but there were no complaints. Just tired hands adjusting cloaks, stiff backs straightening, and the quiet murmur of preparation. Today was the day they would be given their first lesson in fighting, not with words or drills, but with steel. The gladius was a weapon every Roman soldier carried, short, double-edged, and perfectly designed for thrusting in the tight formations of legionary combat. It was not flashy. It was not heroic. It was practical, deadly, efficient. The recruits were called to the armory one by one. When the boy's turn came, he stepped into the shaded space, where a line of gladii lay arranged on a long table. A silent quartermaster, grizzled, lean, and missing the tip of one ear, sized him up with a glance, then selected a blade. "Standard weight," the man muttered, handing it over. The boy took it in both hands. It was heavier than he expected, not clumsy, but dense, balanced toward the hilt. The handle was wrapped in worn leather, the pommel simple and round. The blade itself was about 2 feet long, not polished to shine, but darkened with age and use. He stepped outside, joining the others as they formed up once more. Gaius stood waiting at the edge of the training ring, arms crossed, the vine staff resting lightly against one boot. "You are not swordsmen," he began, voice steady. "You are not duelists. You are not heroes in stories. You are Roman legionaries. And the gladius is not for waving. It is for killing, quickly, quietly, cleanly." He walked slowly down the line. "You do not slash," he continued. "You thrust. You do not twirl. You step. You do not show your blade. you bury it. He raised a hand, and at his signal, wooden training posts were brought into the yard. Thick, upright logs, planted deep into the earth, worn smooth by countless drills. Your enemy will not wait for you to find your courage, Gaius said. So find it now. They began. Each man faced a post, gladius in hand, feet planted wide. Gaius demonstrated the basic stance, left foot forward, shield high, sword held low at the hip. Then he stepped forward, driving the point of his blade into the wood with a sharp, economical thrust. The recruits followed. At first the boy moved awkwardly. His blade glanced off the post at an angle, sliding sideways. Gaius walked by, tapping his shoulder. Lower. Use your legs. The power isn't in your arms, it's in your hips. He tried again. This time, the gladius struck true, embedding into the post with a satisfying thunk. The vibration travelled up the blade and into his wrist, but it felt right. He pulled back, reset, and struck again, and again, and again. The sun rose higher. Sweat dripped into his eyes. His arm trembled from repetition, but he kept going. Around him, the rhythm of training filled the air. The dull impact of blade on wood, the grunts of effort, the occasional bark of correction. Dust swirled around their feet, and the smell of oiled leather and metal hung heavy in the air. By midday, the posts were scarred with hundreds of punctures, and the recruits were spent. Arms limp, cloaks soaked through, wrists red from the shock of contact. Still, they stood in line. Still, they practiced. Gaius walked past the boy one final time. "You strike like someone who's fought thorns," he said, almost approving. "Good. Thorns fight back." The boy didn't respond. He was too tired for pride, too sore for speech. He looked down at the blade in his hand, now streaked with dust and sweat. He had held it. He had used it. And it had answered. Not with glory, with purpose. That night, the camp settled into a rhythm softer than most. The day's training had worn everyone down to the bone, leaving little room for noise or boastful chatter. Even the crackling of the fires seemed gentler, their flames swaying lazily as smoke drifted into the warm night air. The stars were out early, shining in clusters above the quiet outpost, while the moon hovered low over the cypress trees on the horizon. The boy sat cross-legged near one of the smaller fires, his legs stretched out before him, feet bare and sore. His caligae rested beside him, still dust-covered, their straps tangled like dry vines. He leaned back slightly, palms pressed into the earth behind him, and let the warmth of the fire soak into his skin. The wood popped softly, and the smell of smoke clung to his cloak, but he didn't mind. Around the fire sat a handful of other recruits, some younger, some older, but all now bound by the same bruises, the same sunburns, the same heavy-handed corrections from Gaius. They didn't talk much at first, just shared the space, listened to the fire, passed a water skin between them. It was the boy with the crooked nose who spoke first. "Remember your first day?" he said, voice low. "When we couldn't even stand straight?" A few of them chuckled softly. "I thought I was going to faint from just holding the shield," another added. The boy smiled faintly, but said nothing. One of them poked the fire with a stick. "Gaius says we're not soldiers yet, that we're still soft." The boy looked at the flames, then at his palms. Rough now, calloused in places that had been smooth only weeks ago. "He's right," he said quietly. The group fell silent again, but not uncomfortably. It was the silence that came from people who didn't need to prove anything to one another anymore. They had all been through the same marches, the same drills, the same dull pain in their feet, and fire in their arms. After a moment, the older recruit with the short beard leaned forward and tossed a small bundle of herbs into the fire. The smoke turned fragrant, thyme and wild sage, and a few heads lifted as the new scent spread around the circle. "Back home," the man said. "My father used to burn sage before winter. Said it kept the bad spirits out of the house." A few nodded, not because they believed it, but because they understood what it meant to carry small traditions into hard places. The boy stared into the fire, watching the flames curl around the blackened logs, and thought about his own family. His mother's bread, his father's quiet lessons in the fields, the rhythm of harvest. It felt far away now, like a dream worn thin by the sound of marching boots and the weight of a blade at his hip. Still, he carried it. They all did, in some way. Pieces of a life before the Legion, kept in small gestures and old stories, shared only when the night was calm enough to remember. "Tomorrow," said one of the younger recruits. "They're bringing the horses through. For the officers." There was a pause. "Can we trade places?" someone asked dryly. "I'll hold the shield. The horse can carry the pack." The laughter was soft, but genuine. The boy leaned his head back and looked up at the sky. The stars had thickened above them, more now than earlier, stretching from one edge of the horizon to the other. He could almost trace the constellations. The hunter, the bear, the twins, just as he had as a child lying in the fields after a long day's work. Here too he was working, but it was different now. Harder, yes. Lonelier, perhaps. But there was something solid beneath it. Something earned. The fire crackled again, and the smell of sage lingered. They didn't speak much after that, just sat in the shared warmth of the flames, the kind of silence that carried meaning without needing sound. And when the boy finally laid down, his head resting against his folded cloak, he didn't think about tomorrow's drills. He thought about how far he had come, and how much farther he still could go. The sun had barely risen when the horn sounded. Not the usual blast that marked the start of drills, but something deeper, longer. A tone that vibrated through the dusty ground beneath the boy's feet as he stood with the others, half-dressed, fastening his belt in hurried motions. There was movement at the gates. Recruits gathered quickly in loose lines outside the training yard, their eyes narrowing against the morning glare. From beyond the main road, a small group approached, not officers, not centurions, but older men, walking in slow, deliberate steps, clad in worn cloaks and sun-faded tunics. Each bore a legionary tattoo on his forearm, just above the wrist, the unmistakable SPQR, inked in blue, its edges softened by time and weather. Veterans. Their boots struck the ground like they still remembered the rhythm of the march, though some leaned on walking sticks now, and others bore old injuries in the way they favoured one leg or another. But there was something in their presence, something weightier than rank. The recruits fell silent without being told. Gaius walked ahead to meet them, offered a brief salute, and exchanged a few words too quiet to carry. Then he turned and barked a command. "Form a circle, now!" The recruits moved quickly, lining the edge of the yard in a wide ring. In the centre, the veterans stood calmly, their faces lined with age, but sharp with clarity. "This," Gaius announced, "is your future." The boy watched as one of the older men stepped forward. He was tall with broad shoulders and a scar that ran from temple to jaw like a crooked river. His tunic was simple, but beneath it, his frame was still strong. "I served in Germania," the man began, voice like gravel smoothed by wine. 12 years, 2 full campaigns. I watched men fall beside me, and I watched cities surrender. I slept in snow, marched through rain, and buried brothers on foreign soil. He looked around the circle slowly. And I'd do it again. Another veteran stepped forward, smaller in stature, with white hair and a kind smile. I joined because I had nothing, he said. No land, no name, just a weak arm and a hungry stomach. Rome gave me a number, a blade, and a shield. And for the first time in my life, I stood in line, and the man beside me didn't ask who I was. He just asked if I could hold the line. The recruit stood motionless, no shifting, no muttering. The boy felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a strange, quiet awe. One by one, the veterans spoke, short words, no grand speeches, just memories, truths laid bare like weapons placed gently on the ground. When the horns sounded, said one, you didn't think about glory. You thought about the man beside you. You didn't pray for victory, said another. You prayed your boots wouldn't break. You learn quickly, a final voice added. Or you don't last long. Gaia stepped forward again. These men stood where you're standing. They carried what you're carrying, and they bled for what you now serve. He looked directly at the recruits. This is not a path to praise. It is not a shortcut to honor. It is long, cold, hard. But if you walk it well, you may earn more than coin or land. You may earn the right to call yourself Roman. Silence followed. Not empty, but full, the kind that settled into bones. The veterans nodded once and began to leave the circle. Some gave a short word of encouragement to a nearby recruit. One clapped a boy on the shoulder, another handed a leather token, a lucky charm, perhaps, to a young man who reminded him of someone long ago. As they passed the boy, he met the eyes of the tall, scar-faced veteran. There was no smile, just a firm nod. One soldier to another. And though the boy had yet to swing his sword in battle or march beyond the walls of this post, in that moment, he felt something stir. Not pride, belonging. He was still just a recruit. But someday, if he endured, if he stood when others fell, if he learned to carry the weight of Rome in silence and in strength, someday he might walk back through these gates just like them. The day's drills had ended early. The sun dipped behind a bank of clouds, and the air cooled with a welcome breeze that whispered through the olive trees lining the training yard. Dust no longer swirled from marching feet, and for a short time the camp felt still, not asleep, but suspended. A moment between movement and rest. The boy sat near the low stone wall behind the tents, a quiet place away from the main path, where the hum of voices faded and the wind carried only the soft rustle of leaves. In his lap rested a wax tablet, still blank, and a stylus poised but unmoving in his hand. The blade of his gladius leaned against the wall nearby, cleaned and oiled, catching faint streaks of light from the sinking sun. He had meant to write a letter. The Optio had called names earlier, distributing replies from villages across the region. Small wooden tags tied with twine, or pieces of parchment wrapped carefully in cloth. The boy hadn't received one. He hadn't expected to. His family, he knew, lived far from towns with regular couriers, but he'd watched the others open their letters, heads bowed, fingers tracing words, eyes soft with memory. He'd felt something stir then, not envy exactly, something gentler. So now he sat, trying to find words of his own. He scratched a single line into the wax. "Mother, I am well." It looked thin, incomplete. He smoothed it out with the flat edge of the stylus and tried again. I eat most days. I sleep when I can. My arms are tired and my boots rub blisters, but I carry them both. That was truer. He paused, then added, There is a man here who fought in Germania. He says the rain there never ends. I wonder what the fields look like wet all year round. The wax filled slowly, line after line. He told her about the food, how the lentils always tasted the same, but how someone had managed to sneak garlic into the pot once, and it had made everything feel like home. He told her about his bunkmates, not by name, but by gesture. The one who always hummed while oiling his gear. The one who snored like thunder. The one who laughed only when dreaming. He wrote about the first time he struck a training dummy hard enough to leave a dent. About the officer who corrected his stance without saying a word, just placing a firm hand on his shoulder and moving him into place like a piece on a game board. And finally, he wrote about the stars. They are the same stars, even here. I look at them when I miss the sound of the goats' bells at night. I imagine I can still hear them. When the tablet was full, he tied it shut with a strip of cloth and tucked it carefully into the corner of his satchel. He didn't know when a courier would next pass through. He didn't ask. Just having the words written, ready, made him feel lighter. As the wind picked up again, he stood and stretched, glancing once more at the sky. The clouds had thinned, and the first star blinked into view, high above the camp. He picked up his sword and cloak, slung the satchel over his shoulder, and turned back toward the row of tents. Around him, the camp had begun to move again. Low voices, the clatter of bowls, a few faint bursts of laughter from the fire circle. He walked slowly, letting the quiet stay with him a little longer. The march continued tomorrow. The drills would return. His body would ache again. But tonight he had written, and in that he had remembered who he was, not just a recruit, not just a soldier in waiting, a son, a thread still tied to a quiet farm, far from stone walls and iron discipline. The next morning's training came without warning. No shouted orders, no horn calls. Just Gaius standing at the edge of the yard as the recruits emerged from their tents, blinking against the morning light, expecting another day of formations and weapon drills. Gear only, he said flatly. No shields, no blades. The boy exchanged glances with the others, but didn't ask questions. That lesson had been learned early. They grabbed their cloaks and belts, slung on their satchels, and fell in line as Gaius led them out beyond the walls, past the usual training fields, past the olive groves and the narrow dirt road that circled the outpost. They walked for nearly an hour. The path narrowed, turning into a thin track worn through tall grass and scattered stones. Birds called from hidden branches, and the wind moved through the trees like water. No one spoke. Not Gaius, not the recruits. There was only the sound of boots pressing into earth and the quiet rhythm of breath. Eventually they reached a wide open clearing, bordered by low hills and sun-bleached boulders. Gaius stopped at the center and turned to face them. "Today," he said, "you will learn to listen." The recruits stood in confusion. Gaius pointed to the edges of the clearing. "Spread out. Sit. Alone. Say nothing." No further instructions. The boy walked to a flat stone and sat, his knees drawn up, arms resting across them. He looked around briefly. The others were settling in nearby, none too close, none too far. Then he turned his gaze to the horizon. At first there was nothing, just the breeze, the warmth of the rising sun, the distant creak of a tree. But slowly the world began to speak. He noticed the hum of insects in the grass at his feet, the dry scrape of a lizard across a rock, the call of a hawk high overhead. A seed pod clattered to the ground nearby, bounced once, and came to rest with the gentlest sound. Time passed. Minutes. Perhaps hours. He wasn't sure. With no orders to follow, no shield to hold, no weight on his shoulder, he simply sat. And in that stillness, something inside him began to shift. The tight coil of readiness loosened. The echo of commands faded. Even the aches in his legs seemed to dissolve. He was not asleep, but not entirely awake in the usual sense either. He was present. A recruit nearby sneezed, and a bird burst from a tree, flapping loudly before disappearing over the ridge. The boy didn't turn to look. He let the sound pass through him. Then, without warning, Gaius returned. He walked between them, slowly, deliberately, saying nothing, just watching, observing. Eventually, he stopped near the boy's rock. "You hear them yet?" he asked quietly. The boy nodded. "What do you hear?" The boy thought for a moment, then answered simply, "Everything." Gaius gave the faintest nod, then turned and continued walking. The lesson ended without a signal. The recruits rose slowly and returned the way they came. Feet quieter now, postures less rigid. Back at camp, no mention was made of the exercise, no summary, no review. But something had changed. That night, the boy sat near the fire and realized how loud the camp really was. The jangle of gear, the scrape of bowls, the low murmur of laughter, the snap of sparks from burning wood. He had never noticed before. Now he couldn't ignore it. He wrapped his cloak around his shoulders and leaned back against the log behind him, watching the fire flicker and the smoke curl skyward. He didn't speak. He listened. And in that silence he found something new. A kind of strength not forged in iron but in awareness. A soldier does not only fight, a soldier watches, waits, listens, and now he knew how. The sky broke open without warning. One moment the midday sun burned against the backs of the recruits as they stood in formation, sweat trickling down their brows, their tunics clinging to their ribs. The next, the clouds rolled in like a slow tide, thick and grey, smothering the light. A wind swept across the yard, kicking up dust. Then came the first drops, soft at first, then sudden, heavy, cold. The rain fell hard. It struck the helmets like distant drum beats, splashed into puddles, and streaked down the curves of their shields. Within minutes, the training field turned to mud, soft earth collapsing beneath their caligae. The chalk lines that had marked their practice formations vanished into the slurry, but the orders did not stop. Gaius stood beneath the partial cover of a wooden awning, arms crossed, his voice cutting clean through the roar of water. "Hold the line!" And they did. The boy gripped his scutum tighter, the wood slick against his palm. Water ran down his arms, his face soaked into his tunic until it clung like a second skin. His legs were splattered with mud. The hem of his cloak dripped steadily, cold against the back of his knees. They had been drilling for nearly an hour before the rain began, working on quick advances and shield maneuvers. Now they kept going, not to prove a point, but because Rome did not teach comfort. Rome taught preparation. "Rain is not your enemy," Gaius called. "Fear is." The boy adjusted his stance, planting his back foot more firmly in the mud. His shield wobbled slightly from the last formation turn. He corrected it. Ahead of him, another recruit slipped during a pivot, nearly falling to his knee. No one laughed. No one stopped. They shifted to close the gap. The wind picked up, flinging rain sideways into their faces. visibility blurred, but the line held. "Forward!" came the command. They moved as one, heavy steps, thick with resistance, boots squelching through the mess. Their shields collided as they pressed together. The rhythm slowed, but it did not break. The boy's fingers ached from gripping the wet handle. His jaw clenched against the cold. But with every step, he felt something grow, not strength, not pride, but resolve. A dull, steady fire in his chest that burned brighter than the weather. They marched 5 paces, halted, raised shields, pressed forward again. Eventually the order came. Rest. The formation broke apart in silence. No groaning, no cheering. Just the slow, heavy breathing of men whose bodies had been tested and had endured. They stepped back toward the racks to return their shields, water still running from the lower rims. The boy leaned his shield against the post and wiped a hand across his face, smearing mud into his hair. His tunic clung to his skin. His arms trembled from the cold, but his back remained straight. Nearby, another recruit laughed softly, a single exhale through his nose, and looked down at the mud coating his legs. "We look like drowned rats," he muttered. The boy gave a faint smile. Roman rats. They both chuckled. Under the awning, Gaius watched them without a word. He saw the way they stood, the way they didn't complain, the way they kept their weapons close even now. He gave no speech, just nodded once and turned away. Later, as the rain slowed and the sun began to return in slivers of light between parting clouds, the boy sat near his tent, cloak wrapped around his shoulders, steam rising faintly from his arms as he dried. His shield still rested nearby, streaked with mud, but undamaged. He looked at it, this battered, soaked, unremarkable piece of wood and iron, and felt a quiet sort of pride. Not for the shield, for himself, for standing, for pushing, for holding, even in the rain. After a long day in the practice arena, the boy moved slowly. Every step from the training yard back to camp felt heavier than the one before, as if his legs had quietly turned to stone the moment drills ended. His shoulder ached from holding the shield. His wrist throbbed from the wooden blade's repeated shocks, and the welt on his upper arm, left by a strike he failed to block, pulsed with each heartbeat. But the scent of food cut through the fatigue. Near the fire pits, the camp's small kitchen team, other low-ranking soldiers, older and quiet, had already begun the evening meal. A pot of lentils and barley bubbled gently over the flames, and smoke rose into the air, carrying the familiar, earthy smell of garlic, dried onions, and herbs gathered from the edge of the road. The boy accepted his portion from a tired cook, the wooden bowl hot in his hands. He sat beneath a crooked fig tree at the edge of the camp, legs outstretched, boots off, tunic loose at the neck. Around him, other recruits did the same, no one boasting, no one talking loudly. Just eating, recovering, thinking. The lentils were soft, barely salted. The bread was hard but warm near the center. Together it was enough. One of the recruits near him, the quiet one with a limp from the first week's march, tore a piece of bread in two and passed half without a word. The boy accepted it, dipping it in the lentils, chewing slowly. The silence was companionable, like the calm after a storm that left everything bruised but standing. When the meal ended, bowls were cleaned and returned, and the recruits drifted off toward the tents. Some sat by the fire, letting the heat soothe aching arms. Others laid out cloaks and slipped onto their mats, already asleep before their heads hit the rolled-up tunics they used as pillows. The boy lingered near the fig tree, staring up at the evening sky. The stars were faint at first, then brighter. They came out one by one, blinking into view. He traced their slow arrival without naming them, his thoughts drifting between the present and home. His body ached, yes, but it was a good ache. Earned. His fingers curled into the edge of his cloak, rough from training, edges singed slightly from drying too close to the fire the night before. Across the yard, the quartermaster paced slowly, checking tents, ensuring gear was stowed, blades returned, fires low. The routine never stopped, but the noise, the urgency, those quieted as the sky deepened to navy. The boy slipped into his tent, ducking beneath the canvas flap. His mat was still where he'd left it, shield propped beside it, gladius wrapped in cloth and tucked at the edge. He knelt to undo the ties on his caligai and winced as one rubbed against a fresh blister. He set them aside carefully. Then, lying back, he pulled his cloak over his chest and let his muscles sink into the mat beneath him. Outside, the sounds of camp faded into a peaceful rhythm. The murmur of tired voices, the crackle of wood, the distant chirp of insects. Somewhere, someone hummed a tune too soft to follow, and it melted into the background like mist. His eyes closed slowly, not from exhaustion alone, but from peace. A rare, quiet kind of peace that came not from luxury, but from discipline, from movement, from knowing that he had given everything that day and asked for nothing more in return than a place to rest his head. He slept before the stars had fully settled overhead, and the camp, full of sore shoulders and empty bowls, rested with him. The boy had hoped for a quiet evening, a little more time to rest his bruises and blistered feet. But just after the meal, as the sky turned the colour of old parchment, Gaius approached with a short nod. "Your turn," he said simply, handing the boy a small wooden tablet with a carved numeral. The boy nodded back, slung his cloak over his shoulder, and rose from his spot beneath the fig tree. His joints protested, knees stiff from crouching, and his back let out a small ache as he stretched. But there were no complaints. Just a deep breath, a quick check of his belt and dagger, and a walk toward the edge of the camp. Guard duty rotated each night. The recruits were called in pairs to patrol the perimeter, not to defend, but to observe, to watch, to learn the rhythm of a camp when the sun no longer guided it. His assigned post was near the eastern gate, just beyond the supply tents. The firelight didn't reach that far, and the moon was only a sliver that night, casting long, ghostly shadows over the stones and tall grass. His partner for the shift was the older recruit with the scar along his chin, a quiet man named Marcus, whose steady presence made even the darkest corners of camp feel less uncertain. They walked their sections slowly, side by side, their boots crunching softly on the gravel, their cloaks pulled tight against the night chill. "Don't expect anything," Marcus said softly, "but always be ready for something." The boy nodded. They moved without words for a while, tracing the inner edge of the rampart, checking the gate latch, pausing now and then to listen. The sounds of the camp behind them were muffled, the low hum of fire conversations, the occasional laugh, a barked order from a centurion preparing tomorrow's drill. But out here, the quiet felt heavier. A breeze stirred the grass. An owl called once, then was silent. After a while, they sat beneath a tree, still within view of the gate, but hidden from direct sight. Marcus leaned his back against the trunk, eyes still alert. The boy mirrored him, resting his hands on his knees, breathing in the earthy scent of the cool night air. "You get used to the quiet," Marcus said eventually. "At first, it makes you feel small, like everything's pressing in, but after a while, it's something else." The boy tilted his head slightly. "What?" A kind of armor, the silence, once you know how to sit in it. They didn't talk much more after that. There wasn't a need. An hour passed, maybe two. The moon shifted above them, slowly. A shooting star streaked once across the sky, gone before either could point it out. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird flapped noisily and then vanished into the trees. The boy stood now and then to stretch his legs, walking the short loop near the gate while Marcus sat and watched. Then they'd switch. The rhythm was slow, comfortable. And when the final torch near the main yard was doused, their shift came to an end. The replacement pair arrived, another tired pair of recruits, rubbing their eyes, pulling their cloaks tighter. The boy handed off the wooden tablet, gave a short nod, and turned back toward the center of camp with Marcus beside him. The fire had burned low now. Most tents were dark. Inside his own, the boy removed his cloak and belt, setting them carefully near his mat. His shoulders still held a chill from the wind, but it faded quickly beneath the warmth of the blanket. He lay on his side, eyes open for just a moment longer, watching the canvas ceiling above him shift slightly in the breeze. And in that quiet, not the silence of sleep, but the silence of duty fulfilled, he felt something settle. He had stood watch, and nothing had happened. And that too was part of being a soldier. The bugle called at dawn, one short, sharp note, and the camp came to life with the now familiar sound of discipline, the rustle of cloaks, the clatter of boots, the low groans of joints waking to another day of strain. But today was different. Today was inspection day. The boy rose quickly, wiping the grit from his eyes, folding his blanket with care. The mat beneath him still held the warmth of sleep, but there was no time to savor it. Already, the centurion's voice echoed across the yard, summoning them to the square. Full kit, tunics clean, belts tight, gladius sharp. He dressed swiftly, tunic straight, belt looped and tightened. His boots had been cleaned the night before with a bit of cloth and oil from an older recruit willing to trade it for a strip of bread. His cloak hung neatly across his back, folded just enough to show pride but not vanity. Every strap tied, every edge tucked. His gladius, cleaned the evening prior, gleamed faintly in the early morning sun. The leather wrapping on the hilt was frayed, but secure. He sheathed it with care, adjusted the placement of his dagger, and fell into formation just as the centurion stepped onto the raised platform. The line was long, 50 young men in neat rows, all hardened by weeks of training, faces thinner, eyes clearer, hands no longer soft. Gaius walked down the line slowly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sound of his boots on the stone echoed like a drum. The boy stood still, chin level, gaze fixed ahead. When the centurion paused in front of him, he didn't move. He heard the slight clink of metal as Gaius nudged the edge of his belt, checking the knot. He felt the weight of the man's stare on his tunic, his boots, the state of his blade. Then a hand reached forward and tugged lightly on the boy's belt loop. "Good," Gaius muttered. "Tight, clean, ready." And just like that, he moved on. The boy didn't exhale, but he felt his chest loosen slightly. After the inspection, the formation held while the standard bearer stepped forward, unfurling the cohort's banner, crimson cloth, trimmed in gold, bearing the eagle and laurel of Rome. The wind caught its edge, and it snapped softly in the breeze. The centurion raised his voice. "You are no longer villagers, no longer boys who wandered into the legions with empty hands and tired feet. You are soldiers in training, chosen, tested, and kept. Not because you begged for it, but because you've earned it." He pointed to the standard. "That symbol is not yours yet, but every step you take, every blister, every bruise, brings it closer. You carry Rome on your backs now. You represent it in your sleep, in your silence, in your stride." There was no cheering, no applause, just a heavy, still silence, the kind that held weight. The formation broke at his order, and the boy stepped back, shoulders sore, but lifted. His gear clinked softly as he walked. Each step felt different, not lighter, but steadier. Later that morning, they received their identity tablets, thin slivers of wood, carefully etched with their name, cohort number, and provisional rank. Not decorative, not ceremonial, but real. The boy traced the carved letters with his thumb. The characters weren't perfect, but they were his. A name that now belonged to something greater than a single field or village. That night, as he lay on his mat, the tablet tucked safely inside his cloak, he closed his eyes with a small, tired smile. He wasn't finished, not yet. But now he had a name Rome would remember. The final morning arrived not with fanfare, but with a breeze. Cool and quiet, it rolled through the camp like a soft voice, slipping beneath tent flaps and across sleeping faces. It carried no command, no clamour of armour or barked orders, just the whisper of something nearing completion. The boy stirred before the horn, not out of habit, but because he couldn't sleep. He sat up slowly, pulling the cloak from his shoulders, folding it neatly beside him. Around him, the other recruits still slept. Some curled against the chill, others sprawled out, mouths open, caught in the deep silence that follows true exhaustion. He stood, stretched, and stepped outside, boots crunching softly on the compacted dirt. The camp was still. Faint plumes of smoke rose from last night's embers, and in the far corner, a mule shifted in its pen, tail flicking lazily. Overhead, the sky brightened, pale gold at the edges, still tinged with blue. Soon the others woke, and the last day of their training began. No drills today, no forced marches, no blade work or shield drills. Just one thing: formation, their final display. They dressed in full gear, the tunics they had sweated through for weeks, the caligae now worn to their feet, the scooter polished as best they could, gladdy sheathed tight at the hip, cloaks folded crisp. Each recruit carried not just their equipment, but every lesson branded into bone and muscle. When they gathered in the central yard, the centurions stood waiting, flanked by veterans and senior officers. At the far end, the standard fluttered gently, crimson, proud, familiar. Gaius stepped forward. "You've trained in sun and rain," he said, voice calm. "You've stood when it burned. You've marched when your legs begged to stop. You've struck wood, shield, and flesh. You've learned silence, discipline, endurance." He let the words hang. "Now, you stand for Rome." The first command rang out. "Form up!" They moved without hesitation. Lines aligned, shields overlapped, feet found rhythm. The boy took his place in the second row, eyes forward, body still. Another command: "Advance!" They moved as one, the sound of boots striking earth no longer a mess of footsteps, but a single steady heartbeat. They turned, they halted, they reformed, again and again. The officers watched. The veterans watched. No one shouted corrections. When it ended, they stood still, not panting, not proud, but present. Gaius stepped forward once more. "You are not finished," he said, "but you are no longer in waiting." He raised his hand, and the standard bearer moved forward. One by one, each recruit stepped to the front, knelt, and touched the base of the eagle standard. A silent oath, not of glory, not of conquest, but of duty. When the boy's turn came, he stepped forward, the weight of his gear balanced evenly across his body. He knelt, touched the cold iron, and felt something settle in his chest. Not excitement, belonging. Later that night, the camp was unusually quiet. There was no wine, no celebration, just firelight and soft laughter and long stares into the flames. The boy sat with the others, cloak wrapped around his shoulders, identity tablet tucked safely in his belt. He listened to the wind rustling the tents. He felt the ache in his arms, the sting of old bruises. He looked at the stars, the same ones he'd watched from his family's field. But he wasn't the same, not anymore. He was a soldier of Rome, not by title, by choice, by endurance, and by every quiet step it took to get there.